this video, I want to do a countdown of the top 5 biggest mass monsters from each respective era in bodybuilding. So we're going to do the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and the modern era, which we would consider the 2010s. So let's start with number 5, which is going to be the 1970s era of bodybuilding. Now, the 1970s is an interesting era to try to pick a mass monster from, or the biggest bodybuilder of that era, because the 1970s is remembered so fondly as being the golden era of bodybuilding, the era of aesthetics. And it's not really remembered so much for big, massive, crazy-looking bodybuilders, but more so beautiful, aesthetic, and flowing physiques. So it's kind of tough to pick a guy that would represent a mass monster of that era. Now, I'm sure right off the bat, if you're thinking of biggest bodybuilders to come out of the 1970s, a lot of people's minds are instantly drawn to thinking of Arnold Schwarzenegger. But Arnold Schwarzenegger isn't going to be my pick for the biggest mass monster of the 1970s. Arnold was a very big bodybuilder, and probably the most famous and most popular bodybuilder of all time, not even counting just the 70s. But Arnold was about 6'2" tall, weighing anywhere between 225 pounds, and I believe around 250 pounds was where Arnold maxed out his physique in terms of the amount of muscle that he had on stage. I believe that was his biggest competitive stage weight, was pushing 250. Now, that's going to be a really key number here when talking about the 1970s. 250 in the 1970s is really the equivalent of a 300-pound bodybuilder today. 250 was a very large bodybuilder in the 1970s. Most guys were in the 220s or lower at a competitive weight. So my pick for the mass monster to represent the 1970s would be a bodybuilder some of you guys might not have heard of by the name of Pete Grimkowski. Now, Pete Grimkowski was a big bodybuilder for the 1970s. I consider him to be one of the biggest pound for pound at his height and his weight. Now, keep in mind I mentioned Arnold was a very tall bodybuilder at 6'2" tall. Pete Grimkowski stood just 5'10" tall and was much heavier than Arnold was, at nearly half a foot shorter than Arnold. Now, Pete Grimkowski was a 3-time runner-up at the Mr. America competition. He actually won the 1977 Mr. America and also the 1977 IFBB Mr. World competition. So he was a very accomplished bodybuilder. Although he never won the Olympia, he was one of the top-tier guys back in the day. But let's talk about why I have Pete as the mass monster of the 1970s. As I mentioned, he was 5'10" tall, but standing 5'10", he weighed between 241, and he claims his biggest stage weight, 261 pounds at 5'10", lean, was what he claims to be his maxed out biggest stage weight, 261 in the 1970s. Now, another bodybuilder that you might think of as a mass monster from the 1970s, you might think of Lou Ferrigno, but actually surprisingly standing 6'5" tall, Lou Ferrigno's stage weight in the 1970s was only in the 260s. It wouldn't be until later when he made his comeback in the 1990s where he was in the 300 range. But at 6'5", weighing in the 260s wasn't that crazy. So in my mind, Pete Grimkowski at 5'10", 261 is much more impressive and freaky from a mass monster standpoint. So that's why Pete Grimkowski is my pick for the mass monster of the 1970s. Now, like I mentioned before, 250 in the 1970s was really what a 70s bodybuilder would consider pushing the limits. And even Arnold Schwarzenegger pushing 250 pounds at his height was probably a challenge for Arnold and probably very daunting to look at if you were another bodybuilder looking at Arnold at 250. But Pete Grimkowski standing 5'10", 261 pounds, that puts him in the category of mass monster for that era of bodybuilding. And Pete was also very experimental for a 1970s bodybuilder from the standpoint of PED use. He claims that on a daily basis, he would push the boundaries of PED use to a total of 10,000 total milligrams a day of different drugs, including testosterone, Anavar, and Milivar. And he also claims he never used GH. And he also claims he was not a very big eater and he didn't have that good of an appetite. So to put on this tremendous amount of size, he relied exclusively on experimenting and upping the dosage of the gear he was taking. So that's another reason why I would put him in that mass monster category for the 1970s era of bodybuilding. All right, now let's talk about the 1980s era of bodybuilding. The 1980s was still a very aesthetic era of bodybuilding. You had much more aesthetic physiques, a lot of very successful shorter bodybuilders that didn't weigh as much but brought insane conditioning. For example, Rich Gaspari, Lee Labrada, Danny Padilla, Samir Bannout, even Franco Colombo winning the 1981 Mr. Olympia. You could consider him to be an 80s physique. So my pick for the 1980s mass monster is a guy, again, a lot of you guys might not have heard of. Some of you guys that are more hardcore bodybuilding fans are probably familiar with, and that is Gary Stridham. Now, Gary Stridham was a freak, especially for the 80s. Not only was he known for bringing insane conditioning, but he had some insane size to his physique from a height and weight standpoint. Standing 6'2" tall and weighing in the 280s. Really generally competing around 285 at that height and weight in contest condition. He was much bigger than pretty much any other bodybuilder in the 1980s. I can't think of anyone that was bigger than Gary Stridham on stage or in the off season. Gary Stridham was a 300+ pound bodybuilder for sure in the off season, probably closer to 310 in the off season at his height. And to give you guys a size perspective here, Lee Haney, 8-time Mr. Olympia, probably the most dominant bodybuilder of the 1980s. Lee Haney at 5'11", weighed roughly 245, 255 pounds on stage at the biggest. So Lee Haney, being the most successful bodybuilder, in some cases gave up almost 40 pounds to Gary Stridham in contest condition. And even as we talk about modern bodybuilding in the 90s and the 2000s, the mass monsters from those eras, 285 stage weight is still a very, very rare accomplishment. So in the 1980s, to weigh that much certainly puts Gary Stridham in the category of mass monster. And I can't think of anyone that out-muscled Gary Stridham in the 1980s or outsized Gary Stridham in the 1980s or had a better freak factor than Gary Stridham in the 1980s. I think Gary Stridham for sure has to represent the mass monster of the 1980s era of bodybuilding. Now, moving on here into the 1990s, this is where things begin to get very, very interesting. The 1990s, many people believe to be the explosion of the era of the mass monster. 1990s, the present day, is what people remember as when mass monsters first started to hit the scene, and that became the new bar. The new standard had been set in terms of the size of a professional bodybuilder. It changed in the 90s because you had so many guys that were so big and so far and above what we had seen before that the other guys had to get bigger to compete with these guys. So we saw a lot of mass monsters in the 1990s. Now, of course, in the 90s, you had 6-time Mr. Olympia Dorian Yates, weighing between 260 and 275 in contest condition. He was 300 plus in the offseason. And many people say that Dorian ushered in the era of the mass monsters in the 90s by setting that bar so high at the Olympia. But Dorian actually isn't my pick for the biggest bodybuilder of the 90s or the biggest mass monster of the 90s. You also had the monstrous Paul Dillette, standing 6'2", 285 plus pounds in contest condition. Although he wasn't as big of a threat in terms of winning titles, he was certainly just a monstrous bodybuilder, and he was certainly a sight to be seen in the 1990s, even next to guys like Dorian Yates and some of these other guys that I'm about to name in this video. Of course, you had big Victor Richards, although he never competed against these pros. He was 5'9" and over 300 pounds in good shape. He would show up to guest posing and blow guys away. Guys like Dorian, big name guys. He was huge, and he was a massive bodybuilder from the 1990s. And many people say he's an uncrowned Mr. Olympia. He should have been pro. He should have competed as a pro. But Victor Richards is another guy you have to consider for the 1990s mass monsters. But for me, there's only one bodybuilder that can take the crown in the 1990s as the biggest pro bodybuilder from that era. If we're talking about pure mass and just stupid size and just a stupid big bodybuilder, both height and weight, a mass monster in every sense of the word, you've got to look at Greg Kovacs. Greg Kovacs is my pick for the mass monster of the 1990s. His reported stage weight was 350 plus, standing at a height of 6'4" tall. Some people say he ranged from 350 to 400 even on stage, and 400 plus in the off season, still maintaining a relatively lean physical appearance. Now, as a pro bodybuilder, Greg Kovacs was not that successful in terms of placings. He rarely placed. I don't think he ever placed in the top 10 at a pro bodybuilding show, actually. But he was, in terms of size and height and weight, the biggest bodybuilder of the 1990s, hands down. Again, some reported weights were like 420 in the offseason. Now, those numbers are a bit crazy, but competition weight, most reports are 350 plus, which is something that is just absolutely unheard of. Now we're coming in on number 2 on our list, which is the 2000s era of bodybuilding. There are a lot of crazy big bodybuilders in the 2000s, but if we're talking the biggest mass monster of the 2000s, there are 2 gentlemen that immediately come to mind. The first of which, Marcus Rule. If you want to talk about just being a pure freak and having a crazy amount of muscle just hanging off the bone, Marcus Rule is your guy. In particular, the 2002 Night of Champions version of Marcus Rule was one of the freakiest physiques I think ever seen on a bodybuilding stage. The conditioning that he brought with the size that he brought, I believe he was in the 280s at that show, just looking absolutely insane and dominant. When I think of a freak from the 2000s, Marcus Rule is one of the first guys that comes to my mind. But you also have to look at Ronnie Coleman, 8-time Mr. Olympia, the majority of those Olympias being won in the 2000s, one of the most dominant bodybuilders in the history of the sport. And in terms of freak factor, it doesn't get much freakier than Ronnie Coleman. I believe it was the 2004 Mr. Olympia where Ronnie Coleman came in at his all-time biggest, 300 pounds on stage, which is an accomplishment that not many bodybuilders have ever achieved, even until this day, let alone achieved a 300-pound body weight in the off-season. 300-pound Ronnie Coleman on stage at the 2004 Mr. Olympia was a weight that not even Marcus Rule could come close to on stage. And unlike some of the other behemoths on this list, Ronnie Coleman was able to win major shows with that major size and not be a guy that destroyed his physique in the pursuit of getting big. He was still very successful and winning Olympias. So my pick for the mass monster of the 2000s is the king, Ronnie Coleman. Now coming in the number 1 spot representing the modern era of bodybuilding, the 2010s, the pick should be obvious. It should not be hard to figure out who we're going to talk about here, and that is Big Ramy. Now, unlike some of the other bodybuilders on this list, 300 pounds was a one-time thing for those bodybuilders. It was a struggle to compete at 300 pounds on stage. It was very rare, very unheard of. For Big Ramy, it's very rare for him to compete under 300 pounds. Now, Big Ramy stands just 5 foot 10 inches tall with an average reported contest weight of 310 pounds. That's the average of where he competes. An off-season weight often exceeding 350 pounds. Some reports that he's gotten up to 360 pounds in the off-season or even higher than that. There's also been some reports that he's competed closer to 320 pounds at the Olympia. Big Ramy at his height and weight are pushing the absolute maximum limits of what a bodybuilder is capable of, and for that reason, he is far and above every other bodybuilder from the modern era of bodybuilding. He is the biggest of the 2010s era of bodybuilding, and I don't think anybody is ever going to come close to Big Ramy from a height and weight standpoint for a very, very long time.